pick a seat. Any of those 4 seats will be fine. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for coming along to this event about the Children's Climate Risk Index, and our focus tonight is on the children. So I'm really delighted that I've got a panel of what I would call friends here tonight, a team that I've been working with for over 2 years, that I've never met in person, apart from one panelist, but this is our first time being together, having spoken, I don't want to add up the number of hours over the last 2 years that we've been together. But the main thing before I introduce our panelists is to think about myself as the director of the Data for Children Collaborative. I am representing young people tonight, and I'm going to explain how that works in terms of the questions that I've got for the panel tonight. But as the director for the Data for Children Collaborative, I could easily introduce a panel discussion to talk about what would be of interest to adults across the world, or to scientists, or to data enthusiasts. But actually what we want to get underneath here is what matters to the young people that we're talking about when we're talking about climate risk. So I'm going to introduce you to our panel this evening. On the far side, we've got Craig Hutton, who is from the University of Southampton, Professor of Sustainability Science, and as I say, has been working with us on our climate change theme for the last couple of years. We've then got Dr. Gary Watmuth, who's an Associate Professor in Land Use and Socio-Ecological Systems at the University of Edinburgh, so a local, and we will talk in more detail about Craig and Gary's roles on the project. And then we've got Sophie Lee, who's joining us from UNICEF. She works in the Climate, Energy, Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction Division. I don't know how you remember to say all those words at one time. So effectively working with UNICEF's headquarters in New York, but UK-based, which is why we get to see her in person tonight, which is great. And then last but not least, we've got James Mollard, who works at the University of Edinburgh, where he's a postdoctoral researcher in natural hazards for disaster risk reduction. So, yeah, a team of experts, and they are representing a much wider team, I have to say. There's some people who couldn't be here with us tonight from the University of Stirling. We've got other members of our team sitting in the audience with us from the University of Edinburgh. And obviously our colleagues at UNICEF as well, we are representing them at this point in time. So in terms of this team and what we've done, I'm just going to hold up 2 little reports. I say little, they're 2 years worth of work. We've got one which is called "The Climate Crisis is a Child's Right Crisis." This is the short version, and this is our Children's Climate Risk Index. And the other, launched last week, is "The Coldest Year of the Rest of Their Lives," which is a heatwave report that has been featured in The Guardian, had a 5-minute segment on Channel 4 News, has been in Washington Post. In fact, I should have looked at the maths today, but I'd say it certainly hit at least 40 or 50 countries around the world, media stations. So we're absolutely delighted with global impact from a multidisciplinary team. And if we remember, hosted by the Edinburgh Futures Institute, that's what we're all about: multidisciplinary teams and impact in the real world. So going back to the children bit of this, we've called it, what have we called it? Their Future, Their Opinion. So what we've done is we've sent a video out through UNICEF's Youth Network to explain what the Children's Climate Risk Index is, and then we've asked them, what would you like to ask the experts that created that index? So all of the questions that I'm asking tonight, I have not edited. They have come from young people themselves. And you guys can ask some questions to the panel as well. But what I thought would be the easiest way of describing to you what it is just to play that video that we played to young people. And I'm going to ask the amazing production team to play a 2.5-minute video. So bear with us and watch what we've produced, and hopefully it'll explain it well to you. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an introduction to the Climate Risk Index being a combination of hazards, environmental shocks and hazards, and children's vulnerability to generate an index. So I'm going to start with Craig, asking a question to Craig. So we've seen a bit of a breakdown of what the Climate Risk Index is about and some hard-hitting statistics that it's generated. But can you just tell us a bit more from your point of view why you think it's important?
Well, first, hello. Thank you for inviting me. Why have we done this? I mean, that's a very good question. Looking at the context in which this has been done, it comes from a very particular point of view, which we, when we first got together, wanted to explore, was when we think about climate change, particularly when we see it reported on the news or wherever, there tends to be this idea that the people who are impacted by it are homogenous. There are cyclones, there are events, and it happens to people, or maybe just to poorer people. But throughout my career, my work in mainly community, some of that with Gary, people are different, people are diverse. There is diversity amongst what we call the poor in different countries in different parts of the world. One aspect to this is children, a hypothesis, and I believe it to be right, and I think this is what we're demonstrating. Children have a specific vulnerability, a unique vulnerability. We can't just say they're little adults. That's not actually quite correct. They certainly experience similar things, and there may be some overlap, but there are some unique characteristics, in fact, of different groups within youth that mean they have different vulnerabilities. And if we care about that in terms of policy and in terms of our response, we have to begin the process of identifying it. And as we know, that isn't always easy, but I think it's a really fundamental thing not to just say that children are little adults or are completely subsumed by the risks that adults experience. And that's why this is a great teaming with UNICEF, with the collaborative, with the team working here. We've got people who can try to put a focus on that. And for me, that was the priority when we first started.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. And definitely what our work has uncovered, and I think that's bringing out that whole multidisciplinary aspect and the kind of social science side that's been really key to what we've delivered. So I'm going to move on to the questions that have come directly from young people. I forgot to mention, I just wanted to talk about the diversity of those young people that have responded to our questions. So we've got UK and Ireland represented, but we've gone as far as Kenya, South Sudan, Greece and the USA in terms of the questions that have been submitted for tonight. So we are a broad church. So Sophie from UNICEF, I'm going to ask you a question from a young person, which was, what was your motivation? A lovely question. And I know Craig's just answered it from a kind of scientific point of view, but UNICEF isn't traditionally known to be a climate change organisation, right?
Yeah, no, thank you, Alex, and thank you for inviting me here today as well. And yeah, I mean, as Craig said, I think we understand from the video as well, like the climate crisis is inherently a children's rights crisis, and UNICEF is mandated to protect the rights of children, so that's kind of why we fall into the climate space. But I think, as we've seen, 1 billion children are already extremely at extremely high risk to climate hazards, and as you were saying, we all know that children are uniquely vulnerable. They're physically more vulnerable, physiologically. They're at increased exposure to climate-related diseases such as dengue and malaria, and they also have their whole lives ahead of them, which means that any sort of deprivations can be intergenerational as well from climate change. But I think in terms of the motivation for doing this, by creating the index, we can see how and where children are most at risk, and that's really crucial for our response to climate action as well. So making sure that we're implementing resilience and adaptation measures in areas where children are most vulnerable, and particularly focusing on the key sort of sectors that are vulnerability, so health, WASH, education, social protection. Yeah, and I think ultimately emissions reduction is probably the only real long-term solution, but adaptation is what's needed for the most vulnerable children now. And that's something we've learned from doing the risk analysis.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of position, when UNICEF first came to the Data for Children Collaborative to present this challenge, It was very much, we need this tool because we need it for advocacy. And that's been such a kind of emotional output to this outcome, to all of this work, is to see that advocacy in action and see people talking about these reports in the media, and also going to COP26 and COP27. We've got one of our team going to COP27 who will speak at a question and answer session with UNICEF. And seeing that live in action has been such a joy in terms of the outputs of this team. So having spoken to a few of you before we started the session, I know there's people here interested in data, so that's great. So I'm going to turn some questions to Gary and James. So just to kind of position the team dynamic, we talked about environmental shocks and hazards. So James was working on what we call Pillar 1 stuff, so the climate work, and then Gary was working on the vulnerability stuff, Pillar 2. So we're going to have a Pillar 1, Pillar 2 off with these questions from young people. So one of the questions is, how easy was it to access and collect the data? Did you encounter any barriers to doing so? So James, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so we're quite lucky that there's a lot of particularly weather, particularly climate data available, and a lot of it is free to use. So everything that went into the CCRI from our side is publicly accessible, it's free to use, you can go and find the underlying data, have a play with it yourself, do whatever you want with it. Obviously, there's caveats to that. In particular, we find it much more difficult, and we know that the data is not as accurate in areas that are both less populous and also less well developed. So, for example, in the UK, there are hundreds of weather stations. They're all recording data constantly. We can get a good idea of what the climate's doing in the present, and that can go into the models for the future. But obviously, in places like sub-Saharan Africa, places in Southeast Asia, they don't have that infrastructure, and so our observations are limited, and the data into the future is also, therefore, less accurate and limited as well. But overall, we, from our side, had much less issues with the data and getting hold of it.
And Gary, what about the vulnerability data, Gary?
Yeah, so the socioeconomic data is quite a bit trickier to get hold of often. Often it's just at the national level. You don't get it subnational because of the way the governments report it. I think we started the process going through and thinking about what are all the things that create child vulnerability, and UNICEF and the team came up with, I think it was 40 some variables. But a lot of countries don't report all those 40 some variables, so we have to start thinking, well, if we use that particular piece of information, we're ruling out that country, we're not getting as much information as deep information for all countries, so we end up reducing that down to, I think it was 23 social variables in the end, where there was maximising the number of countries that were reporting on that, but we're still then at this, often at national level, so we don't always get that subnational picture, which can be quite difficult to get hold of. There are some places, but obviously that's often wealthy, rich countries. They have much better data collection procedures and just an ability to store that data and publish it, whereas other countries, they just don't have that yet. A lot of them, are, with UN support and World Bank, are actually building that infrastructure, but it's just taking time. So it's quite challenging. So
and that's part of our advocacy in a way, isn't it? That we are advocating about getting more data. Part of what we're doing here is it's a first time. In a way, it's a first pass, and it's not perfect. We're missing stuff. There are issues, but that's very much, something that UNICEF can then, with its reach, start to say, well, we need this data. So if this is I think it is part of that process of advocating for data, then that's great. But it is a beginning of that approach as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got another question from a respondent, a young person, asking, can you please include small nations in the index in future? James, that's easy to do, right?
One of the biggest aspects from the sort of the climate side and the environmental hazards is that a lot of the data, particularly when we're trying to project into the future, a lot of the data we can only get from models. We don't have observations of 2040, 2050. They're just not possible. And so we're limited by what the models can physically do. And in many cases, the models themselves are so computationally expensive that we can only actually run them at resolutions that basically engulf these small nations. And so particularly island nations as well, you're essentially looking at a box in the model that is sea with a tiny bit of land in that doesn't really give any idea of what's happening to that island. And it's something we're trying to get, higher resolution, more computational power so that we can then make these boxes smaller in the model so that we can then get something from the model output that we can then use that's representative of these small nations and these small islands.
Absolutely. And Gary, is there a problem in terms of the socio-economic data?
A lot of the small island developing nations were the ones that weren't reporting all of those socioeconomic variables. That's why we took the decision to drop down as many as we could, but if we wanted to include small island nations, we were down to maybe 6 or 7 variables. So there's a trade-off between how many countries we can have in the overall index and how much data we include. So we can have all countries and not much data, or more data in fewer countries. So there's a trade-off. So yeah, again, it's down to that resolution.
Yeah.
We just miss those islands at the moment. We need to rethink that.
Yeah. So the response to the young person that's asked that is, we're trying and watch this space, I think. And another question on the data and the index from a young person is, are the environmental hazards weighted in any way? This is, we had a lot of talk about weighting, didn't we? Are the environmental hazards weighted in any way to have a larger priority as they're more influential on children's vulnerability? So which is worse out of cyclones or floods or heat waves in terms of those vulnerability factors? I don't know, James, Gary, Craig, maybe you want to come in on this one as well.
So I mean, one of the big things is trying to determine how you assess what is worse. It may be that a cyclone only happens once in 50 years but causes massive damage, massive infrastructure damage, massive impact on children. But equally, is that worse than having a particularly bad heat wave every 2 or 3 years? I mean, it is the million-dollar question. Nobody can specifically answer it at the moment. And so from the climate side, we kept everything relatively weighted. So heat waves are equally as bad as cyclones, are equally as bad as things like air pollution. And we know that that may not be the actual case, but trying to actually answer the question so that we can robustly and kind of with some certainty say this is definitely worse, we need to focus more on this, is just something that at the moment can't be done.
Yeah.
I think, just to follow up as well, that with a lot of science questions, the answer is it's complicated, because when you dig down into that evidence as well, with say the heat waves work that we've looked at before, the temperature at which hospitalizations increase for heat waves differs around the world. So hospitalizations related to heat waves increases in Scotland at a much lower value than it would do in Malaysia, for example. So it's quite difficult at the moment to come up with those numbers and weightings and think what's more important, because it does vary countrywide, and even under that as well, when you've got some children will be more vulnerable to certain things if they've got other existing health issues and problems, and poverty plays a part as well. So it gets really complicated, really messy. So for now, it's easier to keep everything as they're all as equally as important whilst we look for that evidence and find that evidence.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think just to back that up, that's a universal problem with any index you make. So, numbers have been involved in different indicators and index development. So putting these things together, you always come across this problem. We've been discussing it on and off for 15 years or something. So there are approaches. They're the beginning of what we're trying to do in these things. There are some statistical ways you might approach this problem. They're limited in their own right. You might use the literature. That's another method that you can sometimes use. Of course, the literature itself is biased. So you might try to use that as a background. And we will hopefully be exploring some of these as we go forward. And then there's a method that myself and colleagues have been developing over some years, and we're still doing some work on it, is the idea that you can actually go and talk to experts in country. You can actually try to weight these by experience of individuals, and in this case, by experience of children and young people. So one of the interesting things is to turn it into a virtue, is when you've got this equal weighting, if you go and talk with different groups of people, government agencies, NGOs, groups like UNICEF, and then go to different livelihood groups, you actually get different weightings. So in a way, these become mind maps. There's no one truth here. There's no one, this is correct. They're based on people's perception and expertise. Now, that may sound like an odd way of doing something scientific, but in fact, that's often how policymakers make their decisions, based upon their own perspective. And one of the things we're hoping to do, I'd like to bring this here in time to the CCRI, is the idea that you can then compare and say, well, government people have these priorities, whereas when you go to the community, and maybe you talk to women, or you talk to children, or you talk to men, you get different priorities. And why is that? What does that tell us about their priorities in life, and can that help us think about the relationship between them? That's a little way down the line, but one of the things we might try to do eventually is make a virtue of that. And it's a little bit of an art, to be honest, but that's okay. It's interdisciplinary approach.
Great stuff, thank you. Sophie, I've got a good question for you from another respondent to our questionnaire. So this one is actually moving over to the kind of more the advocacy and climate activism side of the coin. So somebody's asked, what can be done by the youth and youth organisations, this person said in Africa, but I actually think kind of from anywhere in the world, to avail more quality and real-time data to boost the accuracy of the index? Big question for you to represent UNICEF on, I'm afraid.
No, it's okay. It's a great question. I think there's lots of different ways that young people individually or within networks and organisations can get involved with data collection and also data weighting and validation, as Craig has spoken about. I think one example that I wanted to share was the UNICEF U-Report system, which is essentially a way to collect data on topics that affect children, such as climate change, in real time using sort of mobile devices. So you will submit a survey to it and you will get the responses in real time, and it will be displayed on sort of digital platforms so that decision makers and stakeholders can see that. And ahead of COP27, what we've done is we've done a U-Report that has reached 240,000 children and young people worldwide, specifically on how climate change impacts them and how they are adapting and increasing the resilience. And I think that that's a great way and a great example of how digitally you can get involved. But also I think on the ground, looking at sort of national organisations and institutions, and locally as well, there's lots of ways that you can get involved with data collection in surveys. We have the multi-indicator cluster surveys, for example, which I think there's 188 that have been going on since 1990s, which is household surveys which really look at issues that affect children and women specifically. And there's a series of different workshops you can get involved with, and that's just one example from UNICEF, but other UN organisations as well and other NGOs have similar sort of data collection opportunities. And even in our own work and to do with the index, I know that we're looking at potentially taking it subnational. And one of the key things, as Craig said, is making sure that we're speaking with young people and understanding how the climate hazards affect them and how vulnerability is unique in those communities. So I think having as many youth engagement workshops with stakeholder engagements is probably the best way. But I would encourage any young people to go to UNICEF or UN country offices and see how they can get involved with data collection methods, because there's definitely opportunities out there.
And I think just pulling on Sophie and Craig's last points there, and particularly what the team, the multidisciplinary team, talked about in the reporting that we've done, is around bringing in children as change agents and allowing a voice to be heard. We're doing that tonight by trying to bring in young people's questions, but kind of back to what Craig was saying about the weighting and the expertise. So yes, we've got scientific expertise and social science expertise and advocacy and policy expertise being used, but there are expertise about being a young person who's living life today and being affected by climate change. And I can't comment on that, because I'm not a young person living life today being affected by climate change. I'm worried about my children, but they're the ones, they've got expertise in this area, and we need to listen to what they're saying. And I always think they've got the loudest voice at COP, and it's such a powerful, and maybe that's my bias, that I turn to their voice and listen to what they're saying at COP. But I really hope that the politicians and the people, the decision makers at COP are listening to those young voices, because I think they are incredibly powerful. So one of the other questions that we put out to the young people on our questionnaire was, so we asked them, what would you like to ask the panel? But we also asked them, how would you like to be engaged in climate discussions? And so I'm hoping that a slide is going to magically appear behind me that will just talk about some of the responses. And the panel's not actually seen these responses to what young people think we should be doing around advocacy. So building up capability of young people, creating guidelines, engaging through education. There's a bit of a theme there about where we're like, come on, this is how you can help us help you to understand a bit more. Start at a young age. Learn how to run petitions. And I missed the last one, which was about using social media and online platforms, because that is a great way to engage young people. So I now want to turn it over to you guys and see if there's any questions from the audience to our panel or to myself in the Data for Children Collaborative about what we've delivered. You've seen the maps on the walls and you've seen some of the statistics, so we'd love to hear from you on any questions that you have about the work that we've done. And Ivona's got a mic and she will be forceful in making sure that we can hear. Chris, you've got a question. Thank you.
No worries. I'm curious about, that you've probably plotted what we might call a pathway to impact, and actually this work is somewhere in the middle. That a series of things have happened in the world. You've worked through a data collection process, through analysis, and I'm curious about what happens next. Because to some extent, you need this to have, I mean, it's terrific, right? It's really stunning and well done at reaching so many people, which is part of the impact journey. But what happens next, and what is the risk? Because the risk might be, great news, children are affected and there's trouble afoot. Mm-hmm. Oh, but there's Ukraine. Oh, we haven't quite got time to... Do you see what I mean? So, what's good about the journey next? Impact? What are the risks? Bit of a complicated question, but you see, what happens next, and what do you want to happen next?
Well, we do have plans afoot. Are we allowed to talk about them as ideas at this stage? Yes. Sophie, would you like to do that in a very measured way?
Yeah, I don't mind starting and then happy for others to come in as well. But yeah, it's a really good question, because we've had these sort of global figures come out and they're fantastic, and it tells us about risk and where children are most vulnerable, and that's a great advocacy tool. But I think something that we're moving for, and UNICEF would like to move forward with this work, is moving from the advocacy to the programming tool. So how can it be useful on the ground to implement programs that can protect and help children adapt in key social services? So we're looking at hopefully doing some more granular level analysis, some subnational analysis within countries, so that we can really look at, on the local level, okay, where are children most vulnerable? Where do we need to implement climate smart healthcare? Where would we need to adapt our education systems? And I think that that's something that's going to be really a great move for this project, is if we can bring it down to that level and really make a difference on the ground. But others, please.
Well, I think just to mention as well, I think to answer the other part of the question, what happens next, I think it's already been used by some governments, is that right?
Yeah, it's being used by quite a lot of the country offices and also national institutions and governments. Just one example, we've got the Egypt country office, so ahead of COP, they're using the global analysis and looking at the figures to then put in place the sort of bigger study on how children are affected by these different hazards in Egypt, and what are the key sort of resilience measures that are needed in the key sort of vulnerability sectors. And I think also, just sort of tying on to that, a concrete example is also sort of within the UNICEF work in Madagascar. We're now doing some work and sort of from identifying that droughts are a particular issue, looking at sort of implementing eco-villages, I think it's about 20, to really help make sure that there's sort of sustainable and renewable energy solutions that can help with safe supply and sustainable water and healthcare systems in Madagascar. So even at the global level, the data can be influential and sort of trickle down, but even if we do the analysis more granularly, it'd be even more fantastic for programming.
Just to add something to this, a good question where we go. I mean, to be honest, this was generated in the first place to catch your eye. It's very much about catching your eye with that concept that children are different. 'Cause a lot of people would question that initially. Well, they live with their parents, why does it matter? So showing this distribution, first, I mean, we've got one data point for China and then one data point for small countries. So it's a starting point. It's a global starting point, one value per country. It's a concept, but the trajectory has got to be towards differentiation. I mean, I was talking about differentiating adults from children, but we're talking about billions of individuals as children who have different lives and different experiences depending on where they are, child labour and all sorts of issues. So it's actually a foothills thing. Where we need to be going is differentiating this down to being policy relevant to countries themselves internally, and as getting to the kind of resolution that we're currently hoping to work in I won't name the country yet, but in one country where we're using the latest census data to get right down and think about the statistical relationships. So at one level, differentiation, getting down the resolution is going to be deeply significant, but also a massive challenge. That's part of it. I think the other thing we should be addressing here is, look at COP. One of the biggest issues is adaptation. Everyone's talking about adaptation and saying we need to fund adaptation. What we often don't recognise in adaptation is that it can be highly destructive. You can be maladaptive. You can get adaptation wrong. I've seen that in Bangladesh. Adaptation might involve a huge concrete wall being built to defend an area of rice, but completely destroys the fishing of small communities. Never asked. A big concrete wall. So can we think about adaptation as being much more about data? You don't think about data being an important part of adaptation, but we should be, because it's about efficiency. It's about doing things that target those groups. Should we be spending some money on understanding what adaptation actually is and who we're adapting to? So that's one advocacy point. And then that resolution allows us to think of softer adaptive solutions, not necessarily building walls. Maybe walls aren't. I do remember talking to, again in Bangladesh, where I've done a lot of my work, talking to a lady about floods and the impacts on her children of flood. Now, I was thinking that is immediately going to be about the damage that they experience to their house, the disease. And she said, look, put all that aside. We experienced that. They can't get to school. And I said, okay, that's fine. She said, and the floods come when the matriculation exams are. I can't get my children to matriculate. And if they don't matriculate, which is to kind of graduate, they won't get a job. So my priority is, you need to come and help us during the exams. Or how about moving the exams? And we were there with a load of government people. Never crossed my mind, never crossed their mind, that would be a priority. Now, all we're saying is you go and talk with people, you learn what their adaptation strategies are. Maybe you don't need to build a wall, you need to do other adaptations that they have control over and they can manage. So there's a lot of learning we can do and try to apply. That's a long trajectory, but it is where we're heading in that direction. It's where we need to be heading.
I think just one little last point on the impact part of your question, Chris, and we've sort of done these things with a plan in mind. Where do we want to get to next? How does this facilitate UNICEF building new funding relationships to support the next step of climate change activity? But then Fraser and I within the Data for Children Collaborative think about impact on a broader scale than planned impact. So we think about unplanned impact. And Shan, I'm going to ask you to tell your story about your uncle, because it's these tiny little things that are happening that we would never know. And can you tell your little story about your uncle into the microphone? Because I just think it's the kind of thing that's happening out there that we cannot.
Yes, Sean, tell us about your uncle.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. I feel a little bit like a deer caught in the headlights. I wasn't aware I was going to be asked to do this. So my uncle set up a charity working with Ugandan refugee camps, looking after South Sudanese refugees. And when our first version of the 2020 index was published in August last year, I sent it to the charity, which is called CRESS. It focuses on bottom-up solutions for South Sudanese refugees in the camps in northern Uganda, and they then used it to further their own message and their need for funding, and they had substantial increases in funding for the work that they've been doing, such that they've recently bought a vehicle which enables them to serve not only the refugee camp that they started with, but 2 more as well, and therefore increase their reach by hundreds of people. So it's not an impact that I ever expected to come from this, and it's not a story I expected to be told around the family dinner table, but it really goes to show what the impact of this kind of work can be when you least expect it.
Thank you. Sorry for putting you on the spot, Shan, but I just think it's a demonstrator of what do we not know that the impact has been that's out there of other uncles that are you know. Have we got another question from the audience anywhere?
Behind the shining lights.
Yeah.
Thank you. First of all, congratulations for the work. And I think I have a question for James. So, it's basically, you mentioned a bit on the uncertainty on the side of not having enough data. So as climate scientists, and we know there is never enough data. So my question is, for the projections, which are based on the models, how did you go about quantifying quantities which we can't measure and we don't have in the projections incorporated, such as pollution or, I don't know, land use change or floods and so on? And that's one question. And I have another one also. If you would pick, so from the sources of uncertainty you have, such as lack of data, model projections, I don't know, internal variability, what would be the main source of uncertainty you would cite in the projections?
So I think I'll answer the second one first. I think the biggest source of uncertainty is what will happen. And that comes down, we've tried to make that and mitigate that with using different pathways, different future projections that take into account different things that could happen. But by far and away, the biggest unknown, and therefore the uncertainty in any future projection we do, is what is going to happen. Whether governments will get around a table in Egypt next week and make some real meaningful progress and our emissions come down quickly, or whether this kind of limbo that we're in at the moment where we all talk about doing stuff but don't actually do anything continues for another 10, 15, 20 years. Back to the first question about how we sort of plot these future scenarios. There are these called SSPs, these shared socioeconomic pathways that have been built by academics, both a mixture of kind of data scientists, the socioeconomic scientists, climate scientists, that are essentially these predicted paths, and they follow a set future. So there are different ones. There are ones where we have that immediate change in emissions and reduction. There are ones where we have continued increase in emissions and more fossil fuels are used as energy consumption increases. And so we can, with those, there are different groups that have made, for example, land use. There is a group that has made a corresponding set of global data for how they expect land use to change based on farmland, deforestation, areas of flooding. We have different changes in the emission data. We have the changes in things like ice caps and sea surface and sea salinity. all of those can be put into models these days. So most of the models that we've based our work on for the heat waves, a lot of that comes from what we call Earth system models, which take into account not just what the atmosphere is doing, which climate models maybe 10 years ago used to do, but they also take into account what the ocean is doing, what plants are doing, vegetation, fires, the land, all of that is incorporated into these individual models. So we have uncertainty in all those. Obviously, we don't know exactly how emissions are going to change. We don't know, exactly which forests are going to be cut down, but we can put these into our future scenarios and run along with them and know that we are at least considering the impacts of each of these things.
Yeah, fascinating thinking about sort of Brazil's election this week and what impact does that decision that the Brazilians made have on, where we're going to go down those pathways in the future. It's really interesting stuff. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the audience? Hello. Oh, Ivona's ready to run.
I just wanted to ask whether the index is static or if it will change over time. And if it does change, how will it be updated and what data is used to do that?
That's a great question.
That's a good question.
Where do we? It's Craig or Sophie. Who wants to?
I can do the second part, but do you want to start with the?
Okay. You see some discomfort here because it's a very good question. One of the things that when you establish an index that always occurs is you then think about updating it. So, two ways of updating it. Temporally, do it next year, do it in 5 years, keep doing it. That's what you should do. But that requires you to keep the thing static, to compare between. Or what happens is new data comes in, new methods we think about things, new ways of approaching it. That's good, because we should be refining it. This is our first pass. But then how comparable is that with the past? Do you run two? Do you run one that is exactly the same as you did before and another showing what you're thinking now? In which case, which one do you use? So it's a bit of a universal problem, a bit like the weighting problem. Universal problem when you're doing this is how do you, in the development of indices like these, how do you project them forward? I think in the end you have to evolve and you have to live with that differentiation, otherwise you're locked into something and there's going to come a point when that isn't going to work as well. So there's no one answer, it's a good question, there's no one answer to that, but you possibly need to look at doing some sort of sensitivity, some analysis between what would have happened if you'd kept the same and how you're deviating. And is that all down to an improved methodology? I think in the end you do have to do that. You have to live with part of that consequence. I don't know whether that's what UNICEF is going to say as well, but it's a good point.
No, that's a fantastic answer. I think I was going to answer more from the advocacy perspective. So I think, in terms of updating the index, we've kind of used this to sort of make the case that, I think it's 99% of children are exposed to at least one environmental or climate shock. So we've made the case that children are inherently vulnerable and at risk. And I think that rather than updating the index, and we've spoken about this internally in terms of, should we then look at redoing the data in 2 years' time, in 1 year's time, and having the figures updated, we feel like from an advocacy perspective, we've made the case for this. And really by sort of doing some projection analysis or doing some more subnational analysis and really taking the scale down, it's probably more effective than producing new global numbers at this point, because we know that every child is going to be affected by climate change and we really need to see what the next step into action is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We've always used that phrase from advocacy to programming, so that is leading us to action.
It really is about the programming, and that's where I think everyone is feeling.
Yeah.
This will be so useful subnationally when we get hold of that kind of data, this kind of thing. Gary does a lot of work on, and I and other colleagues do as well, but I'm trying to understand how can we really drill down, use things like remote sensing, Earth observation. So, using land use change, road networks. How can we use those to really link it to what we already know? And can we use them to project forward into the future? This is rather research. I guess that's why there are universities here as well. So it's not UNICEF working with consultants. This is, to be fair to UNICEF, working with research, thinking about how they get on the cutting edge of this, because it needs to be done. And I think that's quite a brave thing. Not all international NGOs want to do that. They want to operate in safe space. But I think it's recognised in UNICEF that there needs to be this opportunity, and therefore they're coming to the university groups to say, how do we do this? And that's explorative. We need to do that.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to be candid about it. We've pushed them a bit too far in some of our research, haven't we? And they've said, oh, not for us.
Yeah, absolutely.
But that's a reflection on the breadth of delivery of what we've tried to do, and then them cherry picking the bits that are going to work for UNICEF as an organisation. So again, that's the collaboration coming together and just using the best parts of the expertise that we've been able to bring together.
Yeah, that's partnership, isn't it? Our job is to hustle that. It's to say we want to do this. And UNICEF's job is to say, well, we've got a political world and there's a balance. But that's a great partnership. We know when there are things they say, well, we don't feel we can sell that yet. That means we've got as far as we can for now. Great. So we'll focus on that, and then step by step, we'll sneak it in other ways. We'll do it. There is a good working relationship that is not just consultancy. It's not do this, here it is. This is how do we develop this conceptually. It therefore is a real partnership. I think that's how partnerships work.
If there's no other burning questions from the audience, doing a quick scan, I do have one last question to each panel member, the same question in traditional panel style. So I guess this is to each of you, and I'm really thinking about it from your area of expertise or even your personal stance on this piece of work. What would you like to see next? So, I mean, Chris has asked a question about impact already, but what would you like to see next in relation to CCRI? And is it, about governance? Is it about policymakers? Is it about activism? Is it about research and developing research? Is it about people in this room? Is it about young people engagement? What do you individually want to see next? So, James, I'm going to kick off with you.
I apologise if I steal all your answers.
I was going to say, I'm at the end now.
First, but I mean, obviously, we want to see action. We want to see this make a difference, and this be something that, doesn't just have its moment in the sun now and, dies a death. We want to see this continue to be used to get governments to do more, to push policy. But then internally, as a data scientist, there's so much more we can do with it in terms of more future projections, being able to look particularly things like the weighting issue, so much more that we don't know that would be so much fun, so much interest to be able to actually research and actually, get your teeth into, and do that new science and make something that, won't just impact the CCRI and improve that, but could also impact and improve other things using other methodologies further down the line as well. Yeah. But I think that's a bit of the kind of scientist in me that wants to just get more data and play with that.
Well, that's a great feature. That's why we've got you on the team, James. Sophie.
Yeah, I think for me, what I'd like to see next is using the data and evidence to really prioritise children and young people in policy making. So I think really building the capacity of young people, they're not sort of these passive victims of climate change. And yes, we highlight that they're the most vulnerable, but I think also they need to be seen as agents of change, as you said earlier, Alex, and really, building their capacity through sort of green skills building, climate change education, disaster risk reduction education, and ensuring that they are meaningfully included in policy making for climate and making, for example, climate adaptation strategies more child sensitive and NDCs, and driving that policy making forward with the inclusion of young people.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sophie. Gary, what would you like to see next?
What they've said, I think. I'd also, the small island developing nations as well, I'd like to, from a research and the advocacy and the outputs perspective, actually figure out how we can cover those areas, because as we've worked on other UNICEF projects in the past, there's this 15% of children that are never in any of these statistics. So we're missing them still likely here because they're not in these data sets. They've never been in a census, they've never been, their parents have never been found, essentially. So there's an ethical issue of, do they want to be found, do they want to be interviewed, do they want to be in these data sets? But we don't know unless we actually do that work and try and find them, and that's the one thing I think I'd like to see more
and they're
of.
Probably some of the worst off because of that, aren't they? I mean,
we're missing those, and those islands, especially with a lot of climate change, the small island developing nations are more likely to be higher risk. So we're getting that bit done next, I think.
Prioritising those most at risk, absolutely. Craig, you've been
yes, all of these
three.
Absolutely. I mean, building a little bit on what Sophie said, the things that certainly interest me is downscaling, and we're beginning to look at that. I think we need to downscale to begin to address policy. So that's one thing, and how you do that. The conceptualization, we spent a lot of time thinking how we might go about that. Very interested in 2050 scenarios of the future. I work a lot in scenarios, conceptual scenarios with governments and organizations, and then translating that into models, particularly in the sort of social economic side, because we're missing that. We're better at doing the physics, though that's still a big challenge, than we are at understanding the future of social economics, because things can pivot, they're more chaotic, and as we were discussing earlier today, you just don't know what those black swans are, the wars, it's not in our models. So all of that absolutely makes sense. But if there was one thing that I would like to think we might be able to do, is we're talking here about advocacy and listening to the voice of children and giving that priority and weight and saying that this is valued. But how do you, when you listen, when you've understood that, and you hear those things, how does that change these maps, or the maps we generate, or the outcomes of our maps? And I'm very interested in this idea of listening to, of getting communities, mothers, children, and remember we're talking young people, so up to 24, allowing them to actually change the weightings. And that's not an easy thing to do, because who are you going to talk to? Which groups? Who's representative? But you listen to the voice, but you can actually take those weightings, and the colours on your map change. And to me, that's one of the most effective. We've done it in a couple of places, but it's one of the most effective ways of taking often unheard voices and putting them in a cabinet room or a minister's or an NGO's. Their voices represented in the changes in the map, because the priorities are not just heard, they're modelled. They're in the model. Weighting is an opportunity if we actually get those a bit. Now, how you do that is a big, and we've got lots of people thinking about, there are people thinking about, but to me, that's a real priority area, because then it's not just their opinion, they're making the maps, they're part of the actual process, and we'll learn so much. We will not have the same view of climate change and children when we've actually talked to people over there. It's just never, in my experience, when you talk to people, you will come away with a different opinion. So that's what I'd like to see, is that involvement in a tangible, in the model, not just the opinion.
And I think we hopefully have a slide with a QR code for showing the actual platform that this information's on, the Atlas, which is online on UNICEF.
Oh.
I'm so sorry.
You're right.
Yes.
Oh dear.
There's a wall.
Sorry.
There was.
So the Atlas is available if you want to have a look and a play around. You see which countries ranked where and how they've scored within those two different pillars. But there has always been in the back of our heads that Atlas and the accessibility of young people being able to feed into it and influence it, like Craig was saying,
yes.
Even to the point where we're like, can they upload a photo of a cyclone damaged part of, let's make this real. It's not just science, it's science and humans, and we need to try and bring those things together. So that's all we've got time for in a discussion. I've got a few thank yous, really. I want to thank the young people that submitted their questions, which were just the right tone. They were brilliant. So, thank you to them, and thank you to our audience as well for their questions. But thank you to our panelists and our extended team that are here as well, and the ones that aren't here. We would encourage you to keep track of our activity in the Data for Children Collaborative on our social media accounts, Twitter and LinkedIn. We've got lots of other projects. We don't just dabble in climate change, we dabble in mental health and poverty and population nutrition and all the other ones that I'm not going to remember right now. We've got lots of teams like this, teams of friends that are working together across disciplines to have an impact on the real world. So thank you very much, panelists, and thank you everybody else.